Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a file that is, well, it's perhaps the most critical economic challenge of this century, maybe the most complex too.
It really is.
How do we redefine the rules of global trade? Especially when the world's fastest rising economic superpower, China, is operating with a model. A model the existing rule book just wasn't designed for.
It's a huge question, a really profound one. And the stack of sources we've got today, it really reflects that intensity, doesn't it?
It does. These aren't just dry economic reports.
No, absolutely not. They're analyzing nothing less than a fundamental clash of systems, a real paradigm shift.
So what's the core challenge they're presenting?
Well, the main thing is that the global trade architecture, the institutions, the norms built after World War II, mostly anchored by the WTO.
Right.
That whole system was built for a world focused mainly on scarcity, tariffs, quotas, a much simpler form of competition, really.
And what we're facing now is,
Right.
yeah, completely different.
Yeah, exactly. Totally different. We're now in a world fighting over, well, the strategic control of trillions of dollars in industrial plants.
Trillions.
Trillions. System-wide state-backed scale, technological supremacy in sectors that, frankly, didn't even exist 20 years ago, like advanced batteries, AI hardware.
So the existing framework isn't just strained.
Oh, it's much more than strained. It's visibly crumbling because it was built on the assumption that firms were independent actors, making rational economic decisions based on market signals.
But now
Now we're dealing with these coordinated economic organisms backed by the full power of the state. The state isn't just a referee. It's the main player, the coach, and often the owner, too.
Okay, that sets our mission perfectly then. We're charting a path away from the old, often idealized, almost theological idea of free trade.
Which was never truly free anyway, perhaps.
True. Towards a necessary, pragmatic, and strategically guided pursuit of fair trade. We need a blueprint for the future because the existing structure, it just can't bear the weight of this new reality. It wasn't built for this kind of pressure.
And the urgency for this blueprint, it really can't be overstated. If we don't define new rules for competition, clear rules,
What happens?
the world risks spiraling into a really counterproductive subsidy arms race, escalating protectionism, which at the end of the day hurts everyone, especially consumers and definitely developing nations who get caught in the crossfire.
So to give you, the listener, a sense of the sheer, almost overwhelming scale we're talking about, let's start with a number that should really anchor this entire deep dive.
Okay.
According to estimates from CSIS, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, cited in our material, China poured an estimated, wait for it, $230 billion into the electric vehicle sector alone.
Just EVs.
Just EVs, between 2009 and 2023.
Let that number just sink in for a moment. $230 billion. That's not private market capital acting on its own. That's not venture capitalists taking a risk.
No.
That is the deployment of industrial policy on a truly monumental scale, a strategic, decade-plus, system-wide commitment. And it was designed specifically to restructure, dominate, and eventually control critical global supply chains for the automotive future.
Which raises the question, how can that money possibly be tracked, audited? Doesn't the very existence of that opaque, massive state investment just undermine the entire premise of the existing trade framework?
It absolutely does. That's the point. The opacity is the strategic advantage in many ways.
How so?
Well, think about it. If you can't reliably track whether a low-interest loan from a state bank or a local government land grant or maybe a specific tax rebate actually constitutes an unfair subsidy,
Then how can you enforce fair competition?
exactly. How do you apply countervailing duties? How does the WTO even begin to assess the situation? It becomes incredibly difficult, almost impossible, under the current rules, which is why we have to start by understanding the mechanism itself. How does this system actually work?
Okay, let's unpack this then, starting with how China essentially rewrote the global economic playbook,
Right.
transforming itself into what the analysts in our sources have labeled the super conglomerate nation.
Okay, so traditionally, the U.S.-led economic model, the one that WTO was sort of built around, it relied heavily on private markets.
Right, driven by venture capital, shareholder returns.
Bankruptcy is a painful yes, but ultimately cleansing mechanism for inefficient firms.
Yeah.
Risk and reward driven by market signals.
But China
Has fundamentally built something else entirely. It's this conglomerate model.
I get the term theoretically conglomerate, like a big company with lots of different businesses. But what does it mean practically for an entire nation to act like one? What does that look like on the ground, in a factory or a boardroom over there?
It means the fundamental purpose driving economic activity isn't just maximizing shareholder value in the short term. It's coordinated industrial policy aligned with national strategic goals. Think of it like a massive privately held conglomerate, maybe like a 1980s Korean cable,
Oh, okay. I see the analogy.
But instead of the CEO answering to a founding family or private shareholders, the entire structure, the banks, the universities, the companies, the infrastructure providers, they all ultimately answered to the central government's long-term 5-year plans and strategic directives.
So it's a fusion.
It's a deep fusion. State capacity, the ability to build infrastructure, train workers, mobilize resources, is fused with industrial planning, setting targets for specific sectors and market incentives. They still use competition domestically, but it's guided competition within an overarching state plan. It becomes a single, coordinated economic organism.
Wow. So it's like combining the central planning power and infrastructure muscle of a huge government thing, dedicated high-speed rail, built in advance, ultra-high voltage power grids connecting industrial zones.
Things private markets might hesitate to fund at that scale or speed.
Exactly. Combining that with the aggressive, sometimes ruthless, global market focus of a giant multinational corporation aiming for market share. And it's all pointing towards a single strategic goal.
The goal is clear: technological preeminence and achieving dominant global scale in key industries of the future.
Critics must have a field day with this.
Oh, they do. Critics call it state capitalism on steroids. Unfair competition fueled by limitless state funds. Protectionist.
And its admirers.
Admirers call it long-term strategic vision. Democracies, with their short election cycles and quarterly reporting pressures, find hard to replicate. They see it as planning for the next 50 years, not just the next quarter.
But regardless of what you call it, the operational result seems undeniable.
The result is the same. The model uses its vast GDP, its huge domestic market, and its policy muscle to nurture entire industries, often with indefinite support, continuing long after a Western company would have had to prove profitability or face bankruptcy.
Supporting them until they achieve
Global preeminence. Regardless of initial market realities, initial profitability, or even sometimes basic economic efficiency in the short run, the goal is scale and market share first.
That level of coordination sounds incredibly powerful, almost like a military campaign, but fought economically. It's not about one company winning against another.
Sometimes it is, domestically, but strategically, no. It's about ensuring the entire domestic ecosystem, the suppliers, the manufacturers, the logistics, the research labs, wins simultaneously on the global stage.
And that leads us directly to the core assertion, the central claim that really defines China's playbook, according to these sources.
Yes, and it's a stark one. It's essentially this: China will cross-subsidize any internal business that benefits significantly from scale economies and network effects until it dominates the global market.
Cross-subsidize, meaning profits from one area cover losses in another, strategically important one.
Exactly. Or, more often, state funds cover the losses indefinitely. The strategy is ruthlessly logical from a certain perspective. If you believe that controlling the production process globally is the key to future power,
not just growing your GDP, but actually controlling the means of production.
yes, controlling the high-value nodes of the global supply chain, the chip designs, the battery chemistry, the advanced materials, the core software platforms. If you control those, you control the future, especially in sectors defined by network effects or massive economies of scale. Growth follows control.
Okay, so if the goal is control, let's get specific. Detail the systematic array of instruments, the tools used to execute this playbook. Our sources are clear. This isn't just about simple cash handouts, right? It's much more sophisticated.
Absolutely. It's a full-spectrum toolkit showing deep government involvement at literally every stage of a business's life cycle, from R&D to export.
Okay, break it down for us first.
First, you have the direct financial mechanisms. Direct subsidies, sometimes hidden, sometimes overt, and tax rebates, often very generous, for things like research and development spending, especially if it aligns with state priorities. Sometimes even rebates on the value-added tax for exporters, making their final price lower. Second, the low-interest loans from the massive state-owned banking sector. This is crucial. These loans are often extended almost indefinitely, sometimes rolled over year after year. The profitability requirements that a Western bank would demand, often much looser, or tied to strategic goals like gaining market share, not immediate profit.
That sounds like a massive competitive advantage right there. The cost of capital, which is the lifeblood, the oxygen for Western companies, It's essentially eliminated or severely manipulated for these chosen firms.
Yeah, absolutely is. It dramatically lowers their operating costs and allows them to invest aggressively in expansion, even when they're losing money on paper. But it goes way beyond just cheap capital.
What's third?
Third, there's guaranteed government procurement. This is huge. If the state says it will buy millions of units of a new technology, whether it's advanced medical scanners, 5G infrastructure equipment, or electric buses, for cities, that guarantees a massive initial customer base.
Which allows companies to scale up production rapidly, knowing they have a buyer.
Precisely. It de-risks the initial investment massively and allows them to achieve economies of scale much faster than relying solely on uncertain private demand. Fourth, think about human capital.
Skills.
Yes. Specialized worker training programs, often run by local governments or universities in direct partnership with industry. Subsidies for hiring high-tech PhDs and engineers. Ensuring a steady supply of high-quality, disciplined, and often relatively low-cost labor, tailored specifically to the needs of these strategic industries.
And infrastructure must play a massive role too, right? You can't reach global scale without incredible domestic capacity to build and ship things.
Absolutely critical. The fifth instrument is massive, coordinated infrastructure investments. We're talking dedicated industrial parks with pre-built facilities and cheap, reliable utilities. High-speed rail and port networks designed specifically for efficient export logistics. Integrated supply chains where suppliers are co-located or connected by state-funded logistics systems. All of this is largely paid for by the state, which dramatically lowers the operational costs for domestic firms compared to competitors operating elsewhere.
It's a whole ecosystem.
It is an ecosystem. And the sources stress this isn't new. Beijing has been systematically deploying industrial policy as a core national strategy tool for over 2 decades now, refining it, scaling it up. The sheer scale and coordination dwarfs the strategies once pursued by even ambitious nations like Japan with MITI or South Korea with its cables.
And the conclusion is stark.
The conclusion from these analyses is that private capital, operating under standard Western market constraints, needing to show quarterly profits, facing real borrowing costs, dealing with fragmented infrastructure, simply cannot match this coordinated, deeply subsidized, long-term level of state-backed investment. It's a fundamental asymmetry.
Okay, let's make this concrete. The green economy, EVs, solar, batteries, provides the most recent, the clearest, and maybe the most politically charged examples of this strategy in action. We already mentioned the EV sector and that staggering $230 billion figure. Let's go deep on the EV tsunami to understand what that kind of money actually buys you on the global stage.
Well, it buys you immediate, decisive global dominance, or at least a path to it. That massive investment, that $230 billion, it wasn't just handed out randomly. It wasn't just one company getting a bailout.
No, it was targeted.
Highly targeted. It went into funding fundamental battery research in universities and state labs. It went into creating a vast domestic supply chain for battery materials, lithium processing, cathode manufacturing. It involved providing strong regulatory incentives, like making it easier to get license plates for EVs in crowded cities.
And helping local governments.
Yes, aiding local governments in building out extensive public charging networks, reducing range anxiety, and of course offering direct consumer rebates and subsidies, often very generous ones, especially in the early years, to kickstart demand.
Creating both supply and demand simultaneously through policy.
Exactly, a fully orchestrated push. And the result?
What was the result?
It created the world's largest, most robust, and crucially lowest-cost domestic EV market almost overnight. Production scaled incredibly fast, and by focusing laser-like on battery technology, the most expensive and critical component of an EV.
They went for the heart of the technology.
They did. And now, Chinese firms like CATL and BYD absolutely dominate global battery supply chains. Not just for vehicles sold in China, but increasingly for vehicles sold everywhere. Ford, Tesla, BMW. Many are using or planning to use batteries from these Chinese giants.
So they're controlling the most valuable input for the entire global automotive future, establishing a deep dependency for automakers everywhere else.
That's precisely the strategic outcome. And it's not just batteries and cars. We see the exact same pattern playing out, maybe even more dramatically, in solar panel hegemony. This is the classic example analysts point to of industrial dominance achieved through years of coordinated state policy and that relentless pursuit of scale until global rivals are effectively neutralized.
Give us the timeline on solar. It wasn't always this way, was it?
Not at all. The sources paint a really stark picture here. Go back to, say, 2010. China was a significant player in solar manufacturing, yes, but it produced less than half of the global photovoltaic modules. There were major players in Germany, the US, Japan, Taiwan.
More diverse market.
Much more diverse. But fast forward to today. Thanks to years, literally years, of continuous, massive state subsidies, cheap land, low-cost energy, export support, and relentless scale building. Today, China produces over 80% of the world's solar panels.
80%.
80%. Across the entire supply chain, too. From polysilicon production to wafers, cells, and final module assembly, they achieved this through a coordinated national effort to drive manufacturing costs down relentlessly, down to a level that rivals in higher-cost locations like Germany, the US, or Japan simply couldn't sustain without similar levels of state support, which they mostly didn't get.
But this dominance isn't just about manufacturing efficiency, though, is it? It's also about controlling the raw materials, the inputs, which reinforces the whole structure.
Absolutely. That's the other pincer in the strategy. They didn't just focus on the factories. They simultaneously invested heavily, both domestically and abroad, through state-owned enterprises in controlling the upstream processes.
So like refining.
Exactly. China now controls the vast majority of the world's lithium refining capacity essential for batteries, and the processing of rare earth elements, which are vital for wind turbine magnets and other green tech. This dual control mastery over the manufacturing technology and dominance over the upstream materials needed to make it makes China the absolutely indisputable global hub for affordable green technology.
Okay, sources refer to this outcome as industrial hegemony. What's the real difference between just being a successful market leader, like, say, Intel was in chips for a long time, and achieving this kind of hegemony?
It's a critical distinction. Market leadership usually implies success based on innovation, competitive pricing, driven by genuine efficiency, maybe first-mover advantages. Hegemony, in this context the sources use, implies something more. It implies strategic dominance achieved not just through market efficiency, but through deliberate, coordinated, long-term state action specifically designed to achieve a monopoly-scale influence over a critical global sector.
So it's the intent and the method that differ.
Yes, and the outcome. When you produce 80% or more of the world's supply of something essential, you effectively set the global price floor. You dictate the supply chain standards. You essentially determine who else can even participate in the market globally and on what terms. It's a different level of control.
And the scale itself becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, doesn't it? Once China reaches this critical mass in a sector like solar or batteries.
The sheer volume of production drives their costs down further and further through learning curves and economies of scale. This creates an almost insurmountable competitive advantage. It forces global prices down for everyone.
Which sounds good for consumers initially.
Initially, yes. Cheaper solar panels, cheaper EVs. But it creates an advantage that no rival nation, acting purely on private market principles without massive state intervention of its own, can realistically sustain in the long run. Their companies just can't compete with that subsidized scale. Now, before we dive into the friction and the problems this model creates globally, it's really important we pause and thoroughly present the counter-argument from China's perspective. This is critical for understanding the whole geopolitical debate.
Absolutely. We need to hear their side.
From Beijing's perspective, as articulated by officials and state media cited in our sources, they argue this system is not economic aggression aimed at hurting other countries. They frame it as simply modernization by design.
Modernization by design, meaning?
Meaning a legitimate, state-led effort to rapidly develop their economy, move up the value chain, and achieve the kind of technological parity and prosperity that Western nations already enjoy. And they view it as fundamentally no different, at least in spirit, from historical policies used by Western countries themselves during their own development phases.
That's a powerful claim, and one we definitely need to probe. Wait a minute, though. The sources confirm China benefits from world-class logistics, infrastructure, a huge domestic market, a disciplined labor force. All true. But isn't a lot of that infrastructure, the ports, the rails, the power grids, also heavily subsidized or state-funded? If so, doesn't their claim that success is just down to comparative advantage and market competition start to fall apart a bit?
That is precisely the core conflict, the nub of the disagreement. Chinese officials often push back by pointing to historical Western examples. They frequently remind interlocutors that the American digital age, the foundation of Silicon Valley's success, was significantly underwritten by U.S. public investment.
You mean like?
They point specifically to U.S. comparisons. How DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and the NSF National Science Foundation funded decades of foundational research that led to the Internet, GPS technology, early semiconductor breakthroughs, even early AI research, technologies that were later commercialized by private companies, generating massive wealth.
So their argument is you did it too.
Right.
Essentially, yes. They argue that the state playing a role in funding high-risk, long-term, strategically vital technologies is not some alien concept. It's something the U.S. itself practiced extensively. The state's role is legitimate, they argue, particularly in pushing forward strategically vital sectors where private risk aversion might be too high.
And they don't just point to the U.S., right? They also cite European and Japanese examples to legitimize their approach.
Exactly. They often bring up historical analogies like European governments pooling resources and providing decades of subsidies and loan guarantees to back Airbus, specifically to challenge Boeing's dominance in the large passenger aircraft market.
Which was successful.
Very successful. Or they point to Japan's Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, which played a very active role in coordinating investment, setting targets, and facilitating technology sharing to help Japanese companies dominate the global electronics market in the 70s and 80s.
So the question they pose is, the implicit question is, if Western nations used various forms of industrial policy during their key development phases, why is China criticized so heavily for doing essentially the same thing now, as it tries to leapfrog into the 21st century's leading industries?
And officially, they maintain compliance with global rules.
Officially, yes. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce repeatedly defends its policies as being entirely WTO compliant. They publicly attribute their success primarily to things like comparative advantage, like lower labor costs, though that's changing, intense market competition, which is true domestically in many sectors, and the diligence and innovation of its enterprises. They downplay the role of state direction and subsidy in their official narratives.
So, okay, we have to acknowledge, as the sources do, that subsidies are not the only factor driving China's success. It's more complex than that. Where does genuine market advantage meet state backing in this picture?
That's the really complex nuance that the best analysis tries to untangle. China genuinely does benefit from some exceptional factors, separate from direct subsidies.
Like what?
Like truly world-class logistics networks now. Extensive, modern infrastructure ports, airports, high-speed rail, built out at incredible speed, a disciplined, increasingly highly educated, and still relatively affordable labor force, especially in inland provinces, and critically, as we mentioned, a massive, unified domestic market.
That domestic market acts as a huge springboard, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This huge internal testing ground and guaranteed sales base allows Chinese firms to reach enormous scale and refine their products before they even need to seriously tackle export markets. This makes their international launch extremely competitive from day one. So the state's role in the Chinese narrative is simply to accelerate innovation and build capacity where private markets alone might move too slowly or be too risk-averse, especially in really capital-intensive or long gestation technologies.
Okay. But here's where it gets really interesting, right? And where the line between justifiable national development and potentially destabilizing strategic dominance seems to blur. If virtually all major powers now use industrial policy to some degree, the U.S. with the CHPS Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the EU with its Green Deal and digital sovereignty push.
Which they absolutely do. Industrial policy is back globally.
So if everyone's doing it, what is it about China's specific strategy that makes it uniquely challenging for the global trade system? What makes it systemic friction rather than just normal, albeit state-influenced, competition?
I think the crucial distinction, as the analysts in our sources suggest, lies in a few key areas. First, the sheer scale and duration of the support. It's often vastly larger and continues for much longer than typical Western programs. Second, the integration across the entire state apparatus, banks, local governments, regulators, SOEs, all pulling in the same direction. And third, and perhaps most importantly, the perceived endgame.
The endgame.
Yes. When the U.S. government funded foundational technologies like the Internet or GPS, the explicit intent, eventually, was to catalyze open ecosystems and enable broad private competition. The government support was generally seen as a temporary catalyst, not permanent ownership or control.
Whereas with China,
With China's model, the perception, backed by evidence in sectors like solar, is that state support often keeps flowing indefinitely, channeled through state-linked entities, with the implicit or explicit strategic motive of achieving and maintaining dominant global market share. This creates geopolitical leverage and technological dependency for the rest of the world. That's the fundamental difference between catalyzing competition and orchestrating permanent dominance. And that's what the friction really ignites.
So the critics' counterargument, the one driving policy responses in Washington and Brussels, focuses exactly on that perceived intent. It asserts that China's model differs fundamentally because its ultimate goal isn't just national development, which most agree is justifiable, but rather global dominance in key strategic sectors, leading inevitably to strategic dependency for everyone else.
That really is the core, almost existential critique facing Western policymakers today. And the mechanism they point to is now familiar from our discussion.
Lay it out again.
Subsidized capacity, built up relentlessly with state backing, eventually floods foreign markets. The prices are often incredibly low, sometimes arguably below the true cost of production if you factor in all the hidden support. This undercuts incumbent rivals in places like Berlin, Detroit, Seoul, or Tokyo, driving them out of business or forcing them into niche segments.
And this isn't just about losing market share for a few companies.
No. The critics argue it's far more serious than that. It doesn't just reduce competition in the economic sense, it leads to critical geopolitical leverage. If the entire world becomes reliant on a single nation, any nation, frankly, for the essential chips that run everything, the batteries that power transport, or the solar panels needed for the energy transition.
That's a massive national security risk for importing countries, isn't it?
It's a profound vulnerability. Your economic stability, your energy security, even your military capability could become dependent on the political decisions made in another capital. That's the fear driving the push for supply chain resilience and de-risking in the West.
Now, we need to be precise about the terminology here. The sources often avoid the word monopoly because 100% control is rare and hard to achieve globally. But the term dominance seems undeniable in certain areas.
Yes, dominance is the more accurate and widely used term. And we see this clearly in key green technologies, solar manufacturing across the value chain, EV batteries, especially certain chemistries like LFP, critical mineral refining, areas where China's global market share frequently exceeds 70–80% of total global capacity.
And that high percentage share translates directly into real power, doesn't it?
Absolutely. It translates directly into pricing power they can influence, if not dictate, global prices. It gives them control over technical standards. And as we discussed, if everyone else must buy their essential inputs from you, you fundamentally dictate the terms of trade in that sector.
But what's really fascinating, and maybe counterintuitive, is that this relentless pursuit of external industrial power seems to come at an economic cost, even internally within China. This reveals something important about Beijing's strategic priorities.
It does. It shows a willingness to trade off pure economic efficiency for strategic control.
Tell us about this internal economic cost. Reducing productivity seems like a strange goal for an economic powerhouse.
It is strange from a purely neoclassical economic perspective, but it makes sense if the goal is strategic power. The sources cite a significant IMF study published recently. This is cutting-edge analysis. It estimates that China's state-directed industrial policies, while incredibly successful in building massive physical industrial capacity, factories, machines, infrastructure.
Which looks impressive.
Very impressive on the surface, but these policies actually reduce China's overall total factor productivity, TFP, by roughly 1.2% annually.
Okay, let's pause there. We need to break down TFP for the listener. What exactly is total factor productivity, and why is reducing it a sign of distortion or inefficiency?
Right, TFP is a really important, though slightly abstract, economic concept. Think of it as the measure of overall economic efficiency. It captures how well a nation uses its inputs, typically labor and capital, like machinery and buildings, to generate output, GDP.
So it's not just about having more workers or more machines?
No, it's about how productively you combine them. High TFP growth means you're getting more output from the same inputs. This usually comes from innovation, technological progress, better management practices, smarter allocation of resources, basically working smarter, not just harder or with more stuff.
So if China's TFP is reduced by 1.2% due to these policies, what does that signify?
It signifies that resources are being misallocated on a significant scale. When the state directs massive amounts of capital via subsidies or state bank loans towards strategically favored industries, often regardless of their actual market viability or profitability.
Like building 5 huge battery factories when the market realistically only needs 2 or 3. It's exactly. Or propping up inefficient state-owned enterprises because they serve a strategic purpose. That means capital and labor are being diverted from potentially more productive uses elsewhere in the economy. You get less bang for your buck in terms of overall economic growth compared to a more market-driven allocation. That 1.2% drag is the estimated annual cost of that misallocation.
So the big question is, why would Beijing tolerate this internal inefficiency? Why would they willingly pay this kind of strategic tax on their own economy's underlying productivity?
Because it reveals the fundamental strategic trade-off they're making. The analysis suggests they're willing to sacrifice some short-term internal economic efficiency and profitability, accepting that 1.2% TFP drag because the perceived long-term payoff is immense.
And that payoff is global control, or at least dominance, of what they see as the 21st century's defining industries. Advanced semiconductors, AI hardware, next-generation green energy technologies, biotechnology, aerospace. They view this TFP cost as a small, acceptable price to pay today for securing long-term geopolitical influence and technological preeminence tomorrow. The primary goal driving the system isn't maximizing TFP, it's maximizing strategic industrial power.
Okay, so the reality is undeniable. Industrial policy is back with a vengeance globally. State-backed scale is arguably the primary driver of technological change and deployment in many critical sectors now. This forces us and policymakers around the world to confront the profound philosophical challenge right at the heart of this whole issue. How should the world define fair trade in this new era? What does fair even mean anymore?
The existing architecture of the WTO framework, it's obsolete in the face of this reality. It wasn't designed for this world.
Why not? What was its core assumption?
Its core assumption, underpinning most of the rules, was liberalization. The idea was that minimizing state intervention in the economy was the primary virtue, leading to efficient global markets. The rules were mostly about preventing governments from putting up barriers like tariffs or quotas.
But now state intervention isn't the exception, it's the norm, especially in strategic sectors.
Exactly. Now, that significant state intervention is the reality not just in China, but increasingly in the US and EU too. We need rules for how states interact economically. We need rules for state actors, not just rules telling states to get out of the way.
So the challenge is finding a new balance.
Yes. A fair global system, one that can actually function in the 21st century, must somehow reconcile two core principles that seem, on the surface at least, to be in conflict.
Principles which, if we don't balance them carefully, lead straight to escalating conflict, right? What are they?
First, the principle of sovereignty and development. Every nation absolutely has the right, arguably even the duty, to pursue industrial development and upgrade its economy. Building strategic industries is fundamental to national sovereignty, economic security, and achieving higher living standards for its citizens. You can't deny countries that right.
Okay, that's principle one. What's the second conflicting one?
Second, the principle of global stability and competition. No single nation should be allowed to use its industrial power, especially when that power is amplified enormously by the state's full fiscal might and planning capacity to systematically suffocate global competition, deliberately drive foreign rivals out of essential markets, or create dangerous strategic dependencies that hold other nations hostage.
So it's the classic tension between national ambition and global order.
Precisely. How do you allow nations to pursue legitimate development goals without letting that pursuit destabilize the entire global system?
We need a new definition of fair trade, then. One that explicitly recognizes this new geometry of power, where state capitalism is a major force. Trade isn't just about goods crossing borders anymore.
No, it's about data flows. Intellectual property rights, control over standards, supply chain resilience, access to critical inputs. The conflict isn't just economic, it's deeply philosophical and geopolitical. It's about how we reconcile massive national ambition fueled by state power with the absolute necessity of maintaining some form of stable, predictable global economic order.
And importantly, the goal isn't necessarily a return to pure laissez-faire economics, is it?
No, that ship has sailed. Given the current geopolitical climate, the climate crisis demanding state action, and the U.S.'s own significant embrace of industrial policy with acts like CHIPS and IRA, a return to minimal state intervention seems totally unrealistic. The challenge isn't whether states intervene, but how they intervene. The challenge is defining how to make state planning and industrial policy globally fair and sustainable. How do we set rules for state capitalism itself? ###C. The 5 principles of a fair trade order, conceptual foundation.
Okay, so if we need to build this new architecture for fair trade in an age of state capitalism, we need a strong foundation. Our sources helpfully outline 5 core principles proposed as the conceptual underpinning for reconciling state ambition with global stability. Let's detail these comprehensively because they seem to form the philosophical basis for the more concrete 10-rule charter we'll discuss later.
Absolutely. These principles set the direction. The first principle is the absolute bedrock, transparency. This has to be the non-negotiable starting point for any new global framework.
What does transparency mean in this context? Full disclosure.
It means comprehensive, timely, and publicly accessible disclosure of all significant forms of state support to industry. We're talking direct subsidies, yes, but also tax incentives, favorable industrial credits or loans from state banks, discounted land or energy prices provided by local governments, preferential treatment for state-owned enterprises, SOEs, in procurement or regulation. Basically, anything that materially affects the competitive landscape.
And this directly addresses that core issue of opacity we talked about earlier, the idea that hidden support makes fair competition impossible.
Exactly. If we can't see the subsidies, we can't accurately measure the distortion they cause. The current opacity, particularly around the complex web of support flowing through SOEs and various levels of government in China, breeds deep distrust and makes any meaningful dispute resolution under current rules incredibly difficult. If we can achieve genuine, real-time visibility into the scale and nature of state support, then we can at least begin to have an honest, fact-based discussion about whether that support is primarily aimed at legitimate domestic improvement or at achieving unfair global dominance.
Okay, transparency is number one. What's the second principle? It moves from just disclosure to actual discipline, right? Ensuring a level playing field.
Yes, this principle tackles the substance of the subsidies. How do you allow governments to legitimately invest in nascent industries or strategic goals without letting that investment become a permanent crutch, eternal life support that distorts global markets forever?
So how do you thread that needle?
The principle suggests that state support, while legitimate initially, must be temporary by design. It needs to have clear, predefined limits and sunset clauses. Subsidies should be structured to prevent sustained global price distortions, meaning they shouldn't allow companies to systematically undercut global prices indefinitely. And crucially, they must phase down automatically once the supported industries reach certain milestones, like commercial maturity, achieving cost parity with global competitors, or capturing a significant share of the global market.
So the state's role is to accelerate market entry, not replace the market permanently.
Precisely. It's about being a launch pad, not a perpetual motion machine.
Okay. Principle 3 addresses specific behaviors often linked with aggressive market entry strategies. Non-discrimination. What does this cover?
This targets actions that block fair market access for foreign competitors. It states that access to a country's market cannot hinge on coercive requirements. For example, forcing foreign companies to transfer valuable technology to local partners as a condition of market entry, or mandating the formation of joint ventures where the primary purpose seems to be allowing local partners to acquire proprietary knowledge without fair compensation.
And it emphasizes reciprocity.
Yes, reciprocal openness is key here. If a nation expects its companies to freely sell billions of dollars worth of goods into foreign markets, then that nation's own market must be genuinely open to buying competitive goods and services from abroad. You can't have one-way free trade. This principle targets hidden barriers like discriminatory technical standards, biased government procurement rules that favor domestic champions, or complex regulatory hurdles designed purely to keep foreign competitors out.
Principle 4 seems critical for addressing the North-South divide and the concerns of the global South. Shared responsibility. What does this entail?
This principle addresses the reality that achieving massive global scale, often built with state support, confers enormous benefits on the dominant economy. It argues that with this power comes responsibility. It proposes what some sources call value chain justice.
Value chain justice.
Yes. The idea is that nations achieving overwhelming global dominance in a sector, say, that 80% global solar market share we discussed, should have a recognized obligation, perhaps even eventually a treaty obligation, to reinvest a portion of the gains derived from that global scale back into developing regions.
How? Through what mechanisms?
Through genuine technology partnerships, helping build local R&D capacity, offering preferential licensing terms for essential technologies, or co-investing in manufacturing facilities in developing countries. It's a push to make global industrial success a more shared project, rather than a zero-sum game where dominance leads to dependency. It's about sharing the benefits of scale.
And finally, the fifth principle tackles the critical issue of enforcement speed, accountability and enforcement.
This highlights a major failing of the current system. The existing WTO dispute settlement framework, even when it was fully functional, is simply too slow. Cases involving complex subsidies or industrial policies can take many years to resolve.
By which time the damage is done.
Exactly. The industry in the complaining country might already be decimated. The fifth principle states that we need much stronger, much faster dispute resolution mechanisms. These might need to be housed in entirely new institutions or significantly reformed existing ones. They need panels with expertise not just in trade law, but in economics, technology, and industrial organization. And they need to be capable of handling disputes involving complex state planning, opaque subsidies, digital trade issues, and data flows, delivering decisions in months, not years.
Because in the 21st century, speed is fairness.
In many ways, yes. If enforcement isn't swift and effective, the rules become meaningless, especially in fast-moving tech sectors.
Okay, these five principles, transparency, level playing field, non-discrimination, shared responsibility, and accountability, provide a really solid philosophical foundation. But to make them tangible, we need specific tools, specific rules. And before we get to the detailed charter proposing those rules, we need to fully understand the current, most destructive threat that those rules need to address. It's not traditional dumping anymore, is it?
No, it's something the analysts are increasingly defining as structural overcapacity. And it's a whole different challenge. Right? This section marks a really critical shift in how we need to understand the current trade conflicts. For decades, the main concern in trade disputes was often dumping.
Which is usually defined how?
Typically, dumping is defined as a specific company selling its goods in a foreign market at a price below its normal value, usually meaning below its cost of production, or below the price it charges in its home market. The intent is seen as predatory, trying to gain market share unfairly.
But the new threat is different.
The new primary threat, particularly emanating from China's industrial model, according to these sources, is structural overcapacity. This isn't necessarily about one firm's malicious pricing decision. It's about the entire system producing far, far beyond any reasonable level of demand, both domestic and global. And this excess production is primarily enabled and sustained by state policy and subsidized credit.
Okay, let's nail down the definition here because it's crucial. If we misunderstand the problem, our solutions will definitely fail. Why is structural overcapacity so much more dangerous or difficult to handle than traditional dumping?
A few key reasons. Dumping, theoretically, involves proving intent and calculating specific price differentials for one firm. Overcapacity is systemic. It implies that firms might not even be intentionally dumping in the classic sense. They might simply be following instructions from local governments, chasing subsidies tied to expansion, or utilizing cheap state bank loans to build as much capacity as possible to achieve maximum scale, regardless of near-term demand.
So factories just keep multiplying.
Factories multiply across the landscape almost uncontrollably, fueled by policy targets and cheap money, not necessarily by market signals. The sources define structural overcapacity as persistent, state-subsidized production capacity that vastly exceeds both domestic and realistic global market absorption capabilities, leading to fundamental distortions across entire global industries, often lasting for years.
So the end result looks similar. Prices collapse globally. Foreign competitors struggle or fail. But the underlying cause and the legal or trade mechanism involved is totally different.
Exactly. It's harder to pin on a single bad actor firm. It's a feature of the system itself. And the speed and scale today are the key differentiators compared to past episodes of overcapacity.
Overcapacity isn't entirely new, though. We've seen it before.
No, it's not new. We saw major overcapacity issues in steel production globally in the 1970s and 80s, partly driven by state support in Europe and Japan then. Shipbuilding has gone through similar cycles. But what's different today, according to the analysis, is the unprecedented speed and the sheer scale across multiple critical high-tech sectors simultaneously.
And what's fueling this acceleration?
It's fueled by hyper-efficient policy coordination within China, the massive scale of cheap credit flowing directly from state-owned banks without standard commercial checks, and the incredibly rapid deployment of technology and construction capabilities across numerous specialized industrial parks. It's an acceleration problem built into the model. Factories for things like batteries or solar panels can literally multiply in months, not the years it used to take. This drives costs down dramatically through scale, yes, but it simultaneously destroys profit margins for every competing firm worldwide, including, often, the Chinese firms themselves in the short term. #Jinbei. The green paradox and sector specifics.
Now, one of the most fascinating and ironic findings in our source material is what they term the green paradox. It suggests that this economically destructive overcapacity, particularly in green technologies, was often born, at least initially, from a good intention.
Yes, it's a classic story of unintended consequences, writ large. China was facing, and still faces, intense domestic environmental crises, horrific air pollution in its cities, concerns about long-term energy security relying on imported fossil fuels, and also immense global pressure to take action on climate change.
So they needed green tech fast.
They needed it fast, cheap, and at massive scale for their own domestic transition. So the initial goal driving the huge state investment in solar, wind, and EVs wasn't necessarily, let's flood the global market and wipe out foreign competitors. It was more likely, we need to rapidly scale up domestic production to make these technologies cheap and abundant enough for our own urgent needs.
And we absolutely have to acknowledge that from a purely climate action perspective, this state-driven scaling worked incredibly well, didn't it?
It undeniably did.
Right.
The massive state investment enabled the scaling of clean tech manufacturing far, far faster than private markets operating alone probably would have allowed. This rapid scaling dramatically drove down the costs of solar panels and lithium-ion batteries globally.
Making them affordable and scalable worldwide.
Exactly. Which has without doubt significantly accelerated the pace of decarbonization efforts across the globe. That's the positive side of the paradox.
But then came the overshoot.
Then came the overshoot. The problem was the sheer intensity and perhaps the somewhat uncoordinated nature of the state support across different regions and levels of government. The sources note that this intense, distributed state investment soon created production capacity that dramatically outpaced not just China's own rapidly growing domestic demand, but also the total global market's ability to absorb these products. This caused a massive global supply shock in these green sectors.
Okay, let's provide the concrete data points again, because they really illustrate this extreme imbalance. Using the estimates for roughly 2025, these numbers show just how distorted the supply-demand equation had become.
Yeah, the numbers are quite stark. Let's start with electric vehicles, EVs again. By late 2025, China's estimated official production capacity for EVs was somewhere around 15 million units per year, maybe even higher if you count all potential capacity.
15 million. And domestic demand.
Their domestic demand, while very strong and the largest in the world, was projected to be around 8 million units annually at that time.
So that leaves a gap and excess capacity of roughly 7 million vehicles per year.
At least 7 million EVs that needed to find a home somewhere, primarily through exports. That's what created the intense pressure we saw building on European, Southeast Asian, and Latin American auto markets, triggering tariff investigations and trade friction.
And the numbers in solar panels were even more staggering, right? We mentioned China produces 80% of the global supply. But in terms of raw capacity?
Structurally, the analysis suggested they had built enough factory capacity to potentially make twice as many solar panels as the entire world actually installed in the previous year. It wasn't just a wave, it was a tsunami of potential supply hanging over the market.
And this massive imbalance translates directly into price destruction for the commodity itself?
Absolutely. It's basic supply and demand, amplified by subsidies. The sources note that global solar module prices plummeted. They fell by roughly 50% between 2022 and 2025 alone.
50% in just a few years?
Yes. Now, again, great news for consumers and project developers in the short term. Cheaper solar power is fantastic for climate goals. But for manufacturers trying to compete in rival nations like the US, Germany, India, or Korea, they simply could not compete financially at those price points without huge subsidies of their own. This led directly to factory closures, bankruptcies, and significant job losses in the solar manufacturing sector outside China.
And what about the critical upstream component, batteries? Did we see the same dynamic there?
If anything, the battery sector, especially lithium-ion for EVs and grid storage, showed perhaps the most aggressive scaling of all. Global manufacturing capacity for lithium-ion batteries, largely driven by massive Chinese investment, both domestically and increasingly abroad, reached an estimated 3,000 gigawatt-hours, GWH, of annual production capability.
3,000 GWH and projected global demand.
At the time, projected annual global demand was hovering somewhere near 1,500 gigawatt-hours.
So again, roughly double the capacity compared to actual demand.
Roughly double. It means the world, led by China, had built enough manufacturing capacity to potentially power 2 generations worth of electric vehicles for everyone that was actually needed or being bought in a given year.
That structural glut, that overhang of capacity is what fundamentally destroys profit margins everywhere, isn't it?
It crushes them. For consumers, yes, it means cheaper tech in the short run. But for global industrial stability, for fostering diverse and resilient supply chains, and for the principles of fair competition, it means long-term market destruction and consolidation of power. It makes it incredibly hard for new entrants or smaller players anywhere to survive. Towards C. Why old tools fail and the capacity war. Okay, so this brings us right back to the tools we currently possess in the international trade system and why they seem to be failing us so badly in the face of this systemic structural overcapacity. The WTO limitations are fundamental here.
Right. Why can't we just use the existing anti-dumping rules more effectively? If prices are falling below cost, isn't that dumping?
It seems like it should be, but the WTO's anti-dumping rules, as they're currently written and interpreted, have real trouble grappling with this situation. The core problem is that they were designed assuming the firms operate independently, making their own pricing decisions based on their own costs.
And that assumption breaks down here.
It largely breaks down in the face of China's state capitalist ecosystem. Proving classic dumping requires demonstrating that a specific company sold a product below its verifiable cost of production or home market price, often with predatory intent. But in the Chinese system,
It's almost impossible to determine the true cost.
it's incredibly difficult. How do you accurately calculate the true cost for a company benefiting from opaque subsidies, free land from a local government, perpetually rolled over loans from a state bank at below market rates, maybe cheap energy, and integrated logistics support? The inputs are systematically distorted. Furthermore, the problem isn't necessarily isolated malicious pricing by one rogue firm. It's often systemic, subsidized industrial alignment across the entire sector. The whole ecosystem acts, in effect, like a single coordinated entity pushing for scale and export volume. The WTO rules just weren't built to handle that kind of systemic challenge.
So if the WTO anti-dumping framework is too slow and ill-suited, what's the main alternative tool countries have been using? Tariffs, right?
Mostly tariffs, yes. But the limits of retaliation through tariffs are becoming increasingly clear.
How so? Don't tariffs protect domestic industries?
They can offer some temporary protection, yes. But tariffs, even aggressive ones like the provisional 38% tariff imposed by the European Union on certain Chinese EVs, fundamentally do not solve the underlying overcapacity problem. They don't make the excess factories disappear.
They just redirect the flow.
Exactly. They simply redirect the glut. That excess supply, those millions of extra vehicles or tons of solar panels or batteries that can't be sold in Europe or the US due to tariffs, then flows with even greater intensity to other markets. Specifically, it often floods the markets of developing nations in the global South Africa, Latin America, Southeast Asia, where tariffs might be lower or non-existent.
Which then harms nascent industries in those regions.
Precisely. It can destroy local fledgling industries in those developing countries, often before they even have a chance to get off the ground and compete. So tariffs might protect Detroit or Wolfsburg temporarily, but they can inadvertently harm industrial development in Nairobi or São Paulo. It just shifts the problem. It doesn't solve it globally.
And the other response we see, particularly from the U.S., is using domestic subsidies like the incentives in the GPS Act for semiconductors or the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, for clean energy manufacturing. But that carries its own risks, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The risk is that it creates the very thing we should be trying to avoid, a global subsidy arms race.
Everyone trying to out-subsidize everyone else.
Exactly. The U.S. tries to match Chinese subsidies. The EU then feels compelled to match U.S. subsidies. India joins in, and so on. The sources warn that this path risks recreating the same dynamic of state-driven overcapacity, just spread across different geopolitical blocs. You might end up with massive global overcapacity in chips and batteries and solar, just with factories located in different countries, all propped up by taxpayer money.
So we just shift the geographical location of the problem, but we don't solve the fundamental structural imbalance of supply vastly exceeding demand globally.
That's the danger. We might actually worsen the global misallocation of capital.
So the conclusion seems to be that we are effectively in a capacity war. A new kind of global economic conflict fought not primarily with tariffs or quotas, but with policy coordination, cheap credit, and the rapid multiplication of state-backed factories. And the old rulebook is largely useless in this new kind of war.
That's a good way to put it. The new grand challenge for international economic governance is capacity governance. It's about finding ways to manage global abundance, coordinate global scaling in strategic sectors, and ensure that the benefits and burdens are shared more equitably, rather than simply trying to police prices or punish specific companies after the damage is already done.
The solution isn't protectionism, but coordination.
Ultimately, yes. Some form of managed, coordinated scaling and perhaps even managed trade might be necessary in these critical sectors to avoid disastrous boom and bust cycles driven by subsidy wars. And that leads us directly to the profound geopolitical implications, especially for the developing nations caught right in the middle of this dynamic caught between the old Western models and this new, powerful state-led scale emerging from the East.
Right. So what does this all mean for them? We need new global tools built specifically to manage abundance, not scarcity. And crucially, those tools must also address the deep inequalities and power dynamics created by this capacity war, especially for the global South.
Yes, China's massive scaling and the resulting overcapacity has fundamentally redrawn the global industrial map. And for the countries of the global South, think broadly across South America, Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, this rapid ascent of a new industrial superpower presents both a huge opportunity and a really acute peril.
It's the ultimate development dilemma, isn't it? On one hand, the promise of rapid growth, infrastructure development, and industrialization through partnership with China, often on seemingly attractive terms. On the other hand,
The risk of falling into a new form of dependency, becoming merely a low-value cog in a China-centric global supply chain.
the sources highlight this major immediate risk with a specific term, the assembly trap. What exactly does that mean?
The assembly trap describes a situation where developing nations do get integrated into global value chains, which sounds good. Initially, they get factories, jobs, exports, but they only get integrated at the lowest margin, most labor-intensive stages, typically final assembly.
So they're putting together components that are mostly designed and manufactured elsewhere.
Exactly. They assemble imported kits or components, but lack control over the core technology, the valuable intellectual property, IP, the product design, or the high-value upstream inputs. They're stuck at the bottom of the value ladder.
Can you give us some concrete examples of this structural integration that analysts are starting to label quite provocatively as industrial feudalism?
Sure. Think about the EV sector again. While Southeast Asian nations like Thailand or Vietnam might host large, modern Chinese-backed EV assembly plants, creating local jobs.
Which governments welcome.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But the most valuable components, the high-energy density battery cells, the advanced semiconductor chips controlling the vehicle, the complex electric motors, even the specialized cathode materials, those are still overwhelmingly designed and manufactured in China and imported for assembly.
So the highest value add stays in China.
Largely, yes. Or consider raw materials. Africa ships vast quantities of unprocessed raw lithium or cobalt ore, often mined under difficult conditions.
Yeah.
That ore goes to China for complex, capital-intensive refining. And then the high-value refined materials, or the finished batteries made from them, are sold back to the world, including Africa, at a much higher price.
Or in electronics.
South Asia might host huge factories assembling smartphone shells or doing basic testing. But they lack the IP for the core processors, the advanced screens, or the semiconductor fabrication capabilities needed to make the really valuable chips inside those phones.
So the core criticism encapsulated in that industrial feudalism phrase is that this is a form of globalization, yes, but one without genuine value chain mobility for the developing partner.
That's the argument. Capital investment flows in, products flow out. But the core design capability, the technological know-how, and ultimately the majority of the financial profits remain concentrated in the dominant industrial power, in this case China. The host nations risk getting trapped performing low-value, easily replaceable tasks, doing the hard, often low-paid labor, while the intellectual capital and the biggest financial returns are repatriated elsewhere.
It sounds like a modern version of the old colonial resource extraction model, just applied to manufacturing assembly.
Some critics explicitly make that comparison. It's a system potentially designed to extract value and utilize labor without transferring genuine, sovereign technological capability that would allow those nations to eventually design and build their own competitive products. Hashtag B, the promise and peril of partnership.
Okay, but despite these significant risks of the assembly trap, the lure of China remains incredibly strong for many developing nations. Why is partnership with China often seen as the fastest, most pragmatic, or even the only viable path to industrialization for many governments in the global South?
It comes down to simple pragmatism and a lack of alternatives, often. China offers a unique package that's hard for others to match.
What's in the package?
First, unmatched scale of capital. Billions of dollars available for investment, often deployed much faster and with fewer upfront bureaucratic hurdles than traditional Western aid or investment. Second, proven capability in rapid infrastructure development. building ports, roads, railways, power grids, essential for industrialization, often bundled with the industrial investment itself. Third, access to tested, relatively affordable manufacturing technologies and systems. And fourth, crucially,
The political side.
yes, this investment often comes without the stringent political, governance, labor rights, or environmental conditionalities that are typically attached to loans or aid from Western governments, the World Bank, or the IMF. For many governments facing urgent development needs, China's offer looks faster, easier, and less politically intrusive.
And we do see powerful, successful examples cited in the sources where this partnership has driven significant growth and transformation, right? It's not all negative.
Absolutely not. It's a complex picture. Look at Indonesia. They've leveraged massive Chinese investment combined with their own policy demands to move beyond just exporting raw nickel ore. They're now building large-scale nickel processing plants and even aiming for integrated EV battery manufacturing, trying to capture more value domestically.
Or Brazil.
Brazil is actively partnering with Chinese EV makers like BYD to develop hybrid vehicles that can run on their domestically produced biofuels as well as electricity. They see it as a way to accelerate their transport transition using local resources alongside Chinese technology.
Africa.
Ethiopia is often cited. Their investment in large Chinese-developed industrial parks, particularly focused on textiles and light manufacturing, had successfully created hundreds of thousands of jobs and significantly boosted their manufacturing exports over the past decade. These are real development gains.
Yet, despite these successes, the sources consistently warn that this rapid integration, if not managed very carefully by the host country, risks becoming a neo-mercantilist chain, not a sustainable ladder of autonomous progress. What's the nature of that dependency catch?
The dependency catch is multifaceted. First, as we discussed, local firms often remain perpetual subcontractors, dependent on the lead Chinese firm for designs, orders, and key components. They don't develop their own independent capabilities. Second, high-level profits, management control, and strategic decision-making often remain firmly in Chinese hands, with significant portions of the earnings being repatriated rather than reinvested locally beyond basic expansion. Third, and perhaps most damaging in the long run.
The technology transfer issue again.
Yes, genuine deep technology transfer. The kind that allows local engineers and firms to truly understand, adapt, innovate, and eventually create their own next-generation products is often rare or superficial in the actual contracts and implementation, despite official rhetoric. The core intellectual property, the secret sauce that allows a nation to achieve technological sovereignty, tends to stay safely within the dominant partner's control.
So the host nation gains jobs and infrastructure, which are valuable, but potentially sacrifices long-term technological independence.
That's the fundamental trade-off and the core risk highlighted in the analysis. They get development now, but possibly lock themselves into a dependent relationship for the future.
So the crucial question is, how does the Global South break this potential cycle? How do these nations avoid simply becoming the dumping ground for the industrial glut being redirected by Western tariffs, while also avoiding the assembly trap? Our sources outline several potential pathways to greater sovereignty. These seem to focus more on agility, strategic governance, and collaboration, rather than trying to compete head-on with China's subsidized scale.
That's right. Direct competition on scale is likely futile for most. The pathways focus on smarter strategies. The first is the niche strategy, meaning small or mid-sized economies simply cannot win by trying to replicate China's 80% global market share model in massive scale industries like solar panels or basic batteries. Instead, they must identify and focus on areas where specialized innovation, agility, and quality can trump sheer size.
Like what kind of areas?
Think specialized software development, financial technology, fintech, tailored to local needs, customized AI tools for specific local industries like agriculture or healthcare, complex medical devices, niche high-end manufacturing components, or unique design capabilities. Areas where deep expertise matters more than massive volume.
We often hear examples like Estonia and digital governance or Israel and cybersecurity held up as models of this niche specialization. Are there emerging players in the Global South successfully adopting this kind of model?
There are promising signs. Vietnam is often cited for its growing capability and agility in higher-end electronics assembly and its role as a resilient alternative supply chain hub. Kenya and Nigeria are making significant strides in mobile-based fintech and developing specialized software applications, leveraging their young populations and increasing digital connectivity. They're proving that you don't necessarily need a billion people or massive state subsidies to excel and dominate in a high-margin, knowledge-intensive specialty.
Okay, niche strategy is one path. What's the second? The sources stress the need for regional industrial corridors to gain at least some scale.
Yes, because going it entirely alone, especially for smaller nations, is incredibly difficult. Fragmentation, each country trying to build its own separate mini-industry, is prohibitively costly and inefficient. The alternative is regional collaboration.
Pooling resources.
Exactly. Pooling resources, coordinating policies, and creating integrated regional markets to achieve greater collective scale and bargaining power. Think, for example, of the proposed ASEAN EV corridor, where different Southeast Asian nations might specialize in different parts of the EV value chain: batteries in Indonesia, assembly in Thailand, software in Vietnam, creating a regional ecosystem. Or a unified India-Africa digital bridge focused on shared platforms and standards. Or making the African Continental Free Trade Area, AFCFTA, a reality through coordinated investments in cross-border infrastructure and harmonized industrial policies, perhaps focusing on green energy grids or pharmaceutical production.
So collective scale provides leverage in negotiations with global powers like China, the US, or the EU.
Absolutely. A unified regional bloc has much more clout to demand better terms than individual small countries acting alone.
And the third pathway identified is proactive strategic statecraft by the host governments themselves. This moves beyond passively accepting whatever investment comes along, right?
Yes, this is crucial. It requires governments in the global south to become much more sophisticated and assertive in how they negotiate with foreign investors, including Chinese firms. They need to move from being passive recipients to actively dictating the terms of engagement, negotiating from a position of informed strength.
What kind of terms should they be demanding?
The sources suggest several non-negotiables that should be embedded in investment agreements. First, clear, mandatory, and verifiable technology transfer requirements, perhaps linked to specific training programs or joint R&D benchmarks. Second, specific local R&D spending quotas that the foreign company must fulfill within the host country, helping build local innovation capacity. Third, stringent skills development mandates focused on training local engineers, technicians, and managers up to international standards, not just providing low-skill assembly jobs.
So building local capacity has to be part of the deal.
It has to be explicitly part of the deal. Without these kinds of enforceable guardrails, foreign investment risks becoming merely a mechanism for resource extraction or low-wage labor exploitation rather than genuine sustainable development that builds local capability.
This strategic statecraft approach seems to culminate in what the sources call the co-creation pillars. This sounds like the ultimate goal defining what genuine technological partnership looks like, moving beyond mere assembly to actually sharing in the creation of intellectual capital.
That's the aspiration. Co-creation means moving up the value chain from being just a taker of instructions to becoming a partner in innovation. It requires specific, measurable policy tools embedded in foreign investment treaties and national industrial strategy.
Such as?
For instance, instead of simple assembly joint ventures, JVs, insisting on IP sharing or co-patenting JVs, where both partners contribute to and benefit from the intellectual property generated. It demands strong, local value-add mandates, requiring that a minimum percentage of the final product's value, not just the labor cost, must be generated domestically through local sourcing or R&D.
So tracking value, not just jobs.
Precisely. It necessitates deliberate government funding for applied R&D hubs that act as bridges between local universities or research institutes and the foreign industry partner, facilitating knowledge transfer and collaborative projects. And critically, in the digital age, it involves creating open data infrastructure and platforms.
Like treating digital infrastructure as a public good.
Exactly. Similar to how India has developed its UPI payment system or Aadhaar biometric ID as open public platforms. This allows local entrepreneurs and innovators to build new services and businesses on top of that infrastructure without needing permission from dominant foreign tech giants, fostering a local innovation ecosystem. #TagTagDD, leveraging the global science power.
Now, the sources are quite clear. Achieving this shift towards co-creation requires not just strategic action from the global south, but also a fundamental change in mindset and responsibility from the dominant industrial powers, particularly China, given its central role through initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI.
Yes. The argument is that the BRI, if it's to be sustainable and mutually beneficial in the long run, needs to fundamentally evolve its model.
From what to what?
It must transition away from what critics have sometimes labeled the build, loan, and own model, which focuses heavily on lending for infrastructure built by Chinese firms, potentially leading to debt traps and eventual Chinese ownership or control of assets if loans can't be repaid. Towards a more equitable build, share, and co-own framework. This would mean prioritizing projects that involve genuine knowledge sharing, capacity building for local firms and workers, and structuring deals more around equity partnerships rather than just debt. Where unsustainable debt already exists, restructuring it into shared equity stakes in the projects could be considered. And crucially, technology relevant to operating and maintaining the infrastructure or industries must be genuinely shared to ensure long-term sustainability and local ownership, not kept locked away.
And importantly, the Global South isn't just a passive recipient in this potential negotiation, right? They hold significant subsidies. Leverage that, if used wisely and collectively, could reshape the terms of engagement.
Far from passive, this bloc of nations holds immense potential power that is often underestimated. First, resources. They control roughly 70% of the world's known reserves of critical minerals essential for the global green transition: lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earths. Without access to these, the EV and renewable energy revolutions stall.
Second, demographics.
They represent close to 80% of the world's young working-age labor force. While populations age in the global north and even China, the global south has a massive demographic dividend, a huge pool of potential workers and consumers for the future. Third, energy potential. They possess vast, largely untapped renewable energy resources: solar, wind, geothermal, hydrocritical for decarbonized global economy.
So this collective leverage, minerals, people, energy, should be used strategically.
It absolutely should. It should transform the dynamic from one of potential dependency to one of genuine mutual interdependence. The global south needs capital and technology, yes, but the global north and China increasingly need the south's resources, labor, and energy potential. That provides a basis for much fairer negotiation.
This line of thinking culminates in perhaps the most proactive and potentially controversial policy proposal we've encountered in these sources, the development clause. What is that?
Yes, this is a forward-looking idea for embedding fairness directly into future trade agreements or potentially a reformed WTO framework. The development clause would be a proposed treaty obligation stating that when an economy, any economy, not just China, achieves undisputed global dominance in a major-scale economy sector, think controlling, say, 70% or more of the global market for critical input like advanced batteries.
Then what happens?
Then that dominant economy, as a condition of maintaining its preferential access to global markets, would be obliged to take concrete steps to mitigate the risks of dependency it has created. This would involve proactively sharing critical enabling technologies, perhaps through compulsory licensing on fair terms, deliberately opening up its domestic supply chains to allow firms from developing partners to participate meaningfully, and actively co-investing in building industrial capacity within those developing partner nations.
So it essentially forces dominant players to actively practice that value chain justice we talked about. It makes sharing the benefits of scale mandatory.
That's the intent.
Yeah.
It shifts the focus away from the purely geopolitical rivalry of trying to decouple supply chains towards the strategic necessity of actively rebalancing the global architecture. It's about ensuring that developing nations have concrete pathways to move beyond the assembly line, beyond being just consumers of technology, toward achieving genuine technological sovereignty and becoming co-creators in the global economy.
If that's the ultimate goal, co-creation, shared prosperity, and rebalancing global power, then we clearly need a new set of operating rules. Rules designed explicitly to facilitate that kind of transparent, balanced interaction, rather than the old rules that mostly just tried to police tariffs at the border.
Exactly. And that takes us directly to the comprehensive 10-rule charter proposed in the sources as a blueprint for governing this new era of industrial realism in the 21st century.
Okay, so let's synthesize where we are. We've established that significant state intervention in the economy or industrial policy is no longer a fringe idea or specific only to China. It is now the fundamental language of geopolitics and economics, being used actively by Beijing, yes, but also by Washington, Brussels, Delhi, Tokyo, and others.
Absolutely. The sources confirm we have decisively entered an age of industrial realism. The old dream of purely free markets allocating resources globally with minimal state interference is over, if it ever truly existed. Trade policy is now openly acknowledged as a negotiation, driven by strategic national interests, security, resilience, technological leadership, Climate action not just by maximizing theoretical economic efficiency based on comparative advantage.
So since all the major global powers are now using industrial policy tools to shape their economies and compete globally,
Then fairness in the global system can no longer be assumed to arise naturally from market forces. Fairness must be explicitly engineered into the rules of the game. The old rules were largely based on the negative assumption that governments should stay neutral and let markets work. Those assumptions are clearly dead in practice. We need new positive rules of engagement.
rules designed specifically to manage this new reality.
Yes. Rules designed to prevent legitimate national ambition from spiraling into destructive global subsidy wars, exploitative dependencies, or zero-sum strategic competition. We need an explicit framework that acknowledges the reality of state intervention while simultaneously forcing transparency, mutual accountability, and setting clear boundaries on acceptable behavior.
This 10-rule charter we're about to discuss is therefore presented as a practical blueprint, a potential operating system for governing industrial peace and competition in this challenging new era.
Exactly. It's an attempt to build a global framework, or at least a plurilateral one among major players initially, that recognizes the reality of state capitalism while trying to channel it constructively and prevent its worst excesses. It's about managing competition responsibly. #BB. The 10-rule charter, detailing the new architecture. Okay, let's dive into the specifics. There are 10 proposed rules here, building on those 5 principles we discussed earlier. Let's detail the first rule, which goes right back to that foundational issue of trust, or lack thereof. Rule 1. Transparency is non-negotiable.
So, expanding on the principle, what does this rule mandate specifically?
It mandates the comprehensive, timely, and publicly accessible disclosure of all significant forms of industrial support. Subsidies, tax credits, preferential loans, SOE assistance, local government grants, R&D funding tied to specific firms. The works.
And the sources propose a specific mechanism for this, something quite ambitious.
Yes. They call for the creation of a real-time public registry of industrial subsidies, perhaps managed by an independent international body or a reformed WTO secretariat. Think of it like how we now have increasingly sophisticated systems for tracking and publicly reporting national greenhouse gas, GHG emissions under climate agreements. Apply that same level of transparency to industrial support.
Why is the real-time aspect so crucial here? Why isn't the current WTO notification system where countries are supposed to report subsidies sufficient?
Because the current WTO system is notoriously slow, incomplete, and lacks enforcement. Countries often notify major subsidies years after they've been implemented, if they notify them at all. This makes the entire system reactive and largely pointless for preventing distortions as they happen. Disputes currently rely on lengthy, complex post-facto investigations by importing countries, which, as we said, can take years.
So real-time disclosure changes the game.
It completely changes the dynamic. If significant subsidies have to be registered publicly, almost instantly, it allows for immediate monitoring by trading partners and international bodies. It enables timely consultations before disputes escalate. It allows nations to respond strategically and proportionately, perhaps through targeted policy adjustments or focused countervailing investigations, rather than resorting to broad, reactive, and often counterproductive blanket tariffs imposed years later. Transparency enables preventative diplomacy.
Okay, Rule 1 is transparency. Rule 2, sunset clauses on subsidies. This operationalizes the principle of ensuring a level playing field, right? It's the mechanism for preventing permanent distortion and forcing industries to eventually stand on their own feet.
Exactly. Industrial policy should act as a catalyst, maybe a temporary shield, but not as a permanent life support machine funded by taxpayers that shelters industries from global competition forever. This rule proposes that all significant industrial subsidies must include from the outset a clearly defined phase-down plan or sunset clause.
How would that work in practice? What kind of triggers?
For instance, the rule could stipulate a mandatory, say, 25% reduction in the level of support once the subsidized industry achieves certain pre-agreed benchmarks. These benchmarks could be things like reaching cost parity with unsubsidized global competitors or capturing a certain percentage, maybe 20% or 30% of the global export market share. The specifics would need negotiation, but the principle is clear. No strategic sector should live forever on state support.
This moves government support from being potentially a permanent fixture of the economy
To being a temporary, accountable, and ultimately performance-based launchpad designed to help industries reach competitiveness, after which market forces should take over.
Now, how would a country like China, which has provided decades of support to some key industries, react to a rule like this? It seems like a major challenge to their model.
It would undoubtedly require a major internal political and economic adjustment for them, and likely for other countries using long-term subsidies too. It challenges the idea of indefinite state nurturing. But the leverage for gaining global acceptance would be significant. The incentive for China or any country would be clear: accept the Sunset Clause framework as part of a new global agreement, and in return, gain more predictable access to stable global markets with reduced risk of arbitrary tariffs based on opaque subsidy claims. Reject it and potentially face coordinated, internationally sanctioned countervailing duties from a coalition of countries adhering to the new protocol.
So it creates a choice: predictable rules versus unpredictable retaliation.
Exactly. The rule recognizes the state's legitimate right to launch an industry, but denies its right to indefinitely control the global market through permanent, distorting subsidies.
Okay, Rule 3, overcapacity alerts. Given our earlier discussion that structural overcapacity is the new dumping, the new systemic threat, this rule tries to address that head-on, preventively.
Yes, we need to move beyond just reacting to floods of cheap goods after they arrive. This rule proposes establishing a dedicated global overcapacity observatory. This wouldn't just be a passive data collection agency. It would function as a proactive, early warning global macroeconomic tool.
What would it monitor?
It would continuously track key strategic, globally traded sectors known to be prone to subsidy-driven overcapacity. Think EVs, solar panels, semiconductors, batteries, perhaps green hydrogen electrolyzers in the future. It would monitor metrics like global capacity utilization rates, export volumes relative to demand, inventory levels, and crucially, persistent gaps between production costs and market prices.
And what happens when it detects a serious problem? What triggers action?
The sources propose a clear, pre-agreed mechanism. For example, if the observatory finds that global production capacity in a monitored sector consistently exceeds realistic, sustainable global demand by a certain threshold, say 20% or 25% or more, for a sustained period.
An alarm bell rings.
Exactly. An official overcapacity alert is triggered. This should then automatically initiate mandatory consultations among the major producing nations in that sector. The goal of these consultations would be to agree on coordinated, voluntary measures to slow down further capacity expansion, things like temporarily restraining new state-backed loans or subsidies for building more factories in that specific sector until global demand has a chance to catch up.
So it's about managing abundance collaboratively rather than fighting over shrinking shares of a flooded market.
Precisely. It's an attempt to introduce some collective rationality and forward planning into global industrial scaling, preventing the hugely wasteful boom and bust cycles driven by uncoordinated national subsidy programs.
Rule number 4. Rule 4. Reciprocity in market access. This seems to target that fundamental asymmetry we discussed, where one country can freely sell into open foreign markets while maintaining sophisticated hidden barriers to imports in its own market.
Yes, this rule operationalizes the principle of non-discrimination. It says that trade partnerships must be based on genuine, equivalent, and symmetrical market access. You cannot expect to export billions of dollars worth of your goods abroad while simultaneously blocking comparable imports through non-tariff barriers at home.
What kind of hidden barriers does this target?
It targets things like biased government procurement rules that exclusively favor domestic companies, even if foreign alternatives are cheaper or better. Opaque or constantly shifting technical standards designed specifically to disadvantage imports. Discriminatory data localization requirements that prevent foreign digital service providers from competing, or excessive regulatory hurdles and licensing delays applied disproportionately to foreign firms.
So the principle is, if you want to sell freely, you have to allow others to sell freely into your market too. Essentially, yes. Reciprocity ensures that nations cannot build global industrial supremacy purely on the back of exploiting open foreign markets while effectively denying access to their own large domestic market. It demands a two-way street.
Rule 5 takes us back to the Global South. Rule 5, Development Inclusion Clause. This sounds like the mechanism to formalize that idea of shared prosperity and value chain justice we explored in Section 4.
It is. This rule proposes moving beyond voluntary aid or ad hoc partnerships. It would mandate that nations achieving significant, sustained global dominance in key emerging industries have a positive obligation to actively support the development of related capabilities in developing nations.
How would this mandatory co-investment work? It could involve several mechanisms. For instance, requiring dominant firms or the state itself to co-invest in building manufacturing capacity or R&D centers in developing countries, offering preferential access or licensing terms for essential enabling technologies to firms in the Global South, actively helping integrate suppliers from developing nations into their global value chains. The focus would be on emerging high-value industries, think AI tools tailored for developing world agriculture, joint ventures in green hydrogen production hubs, or establishing regional centers for next-generation battery recycling to ensure shared technological power and shared progress from the outset.
So this rule is absolutely central to preventing that assembly trap from becoming a permanent feature of the 21st century global economy.
Absolutely. It aims to ensure that the Global South isn't just seen as a residual market for absorbing the North's or China's excess industrial capacity, but becomes an active, empowered partner in building and benefiting from the future global supply chains for critical technologies. It's about proactively designing inclusion.
Okay, Rule 6. No forced tech transfer, but open standards. This seems to tackle the thorny issue of intellectual property, trying to find a balance between protecting proprietary innovation and preventing monopolies based on closed ecosystems.
Right. This rule has two parts. First, it reaffirms that the practice of coercing foreign companies to transfer their core technology as a condition of market access must end immediately. That's already technically illegal under existing WTO rules,
Yeah.
the TRIPS agreement, but is poorly enforced. It fundamentally undermines trust and innovation. That has to stop.
But the second part offers an alternative path.
Yes, the alternative to forced transfer cannot simply be allowing dominant firms or countries to lock up entire technological ecosystems through purely proprietary IP, creating permanent dependencies. Therefore, the second part of the rule actively promotes the creation and use of open standards consortia in critical foundational technologies.
Like in AI or green energy.
Exactly. Think about open standards for AI model architecture, data formats, or interoperability protocols, or open standards for electric vehicle charging infrastructure, grid communication for renewables, or interfaces for energy storage systems. Promoting open standards allows for greater compatibility between different companies' products, encourages innovation by allowing smaller players to build complementary products or services, and prevents reliance on a single, dominant, proprietary ecosystem. It fosters competition on the standard, not for the standard.
Rule 7 addresses the climate issue directly. Rule 7. Climate carve-outs with guardrails. This recognizes the unavoidable reality that urgent climate action might sometimes require policies like green subsidies or carbon border adjustment mechanisms, CBAMs, that could technically violate old WTO rules designed for a different era.
Yes, there's a clear tension. We need rapid deployment of green tech, which often requires state support. But we also need to prevent climate policies from being used as a backdoor for protectionism. This rule tries to bridge that gap.
By allowing exceptions.
It proposes allowing specific, necessary climate action policies, like subsidies demonstrably aimed at accelerating decarbonization or non-discriminatory carbon tariffs, special exceptions from normal WTO disciplines. However, these exceptions would only be allowed if the policies adhere strictly to three crucial guardrails.
What are the guardrails?
First, full transparency about the policy's design and intended climate impact. Second, measurable climate effectiveness. The policy must demonstrably contribute to emissions reductions, not just protect a domestic industry. Third, specific time limits or review clauses to ensure they don't become permanent protectionist measures, particularly against developing economies that might have fewer resources to decarbonize quickly. The goal is to allow legitimate climate action while preventing disguised protectionism.
Rule 8 focuses specifically on state-owned enterprises. Rule 8, SOE disclosure parity. This seems to target the structural opacity and perceived unfair advantages enjoyed by massive state-owned firms when they compete globally against private companies.
Precisely. The issue is that SOEs often operate under different accounting rules, receive hidden subsidies, benefit from implicit state guarantees, and aren't subject to the same pressures for profitability or transparency as private firms. This rule demands parity.
Parity in what sense?
It states that if large state-owned enterprises intend to compete in global markets, their financial reporting, auditing standards, and disclosures regarding state support or supply chain operations must adhere to the same stringent international standards, like IFRS or GAAP, required of major private publicly listed firms in places like the US and Europe.
So it levels the accounting playing field.
It aims to level the accounting field. It makes it much harder to hide subsidies or cross-subsidization within complex state-owned conglomerate structures. It's impossible to determine fairly whether an SOE's low pricing is based on genuine efficiency or on continuous opaque state support unless the accounting practices are standardized, transparent, and independently audited to the same level as their private competitors.
Rule 9 addresses the critical issue of speed again. Rule 9, fast-track dispute resolution. The sheer speed of technological change makes the current multi-year WTO dispute process almost irrelevant for emerging industries, doesn't it?
Completely irrelevant. By the time a case is decided, the market may have been irreversibly captured. This rule calls for implementing a dedicated 90-day fast-track arbitration window specifically for disputes arising in rapidly evolving, emerging industries. Think AI governance, quantum computing applications, synthetic biology, next-gen semiconductors, green energy breakthroughs.
90 days. That's incredibly fast compared to now. Who would oversee this?
The proposal suggests these fast-track panels must be overseen by a new type of neutral expert body. Not just traditional trade lawyers or jurists, but panels composed of experienced economists specializing in industrial organization, technologists with deep understanding of the sector in question, and supply chain analysts who understand the market dynamics. People who can quickly grasp the technical and economic realities.
Because in these sectors, speed is the new fairness.
Absolutely. A dispute over market access or subsidies in AI that takes 5 years to resolve under the old system has effectively allowed the offending party, if there is one, to achieve insurmountable global dominance in the interim. Justice delayed is market share denied permanently.
Finally, Rule 10, data governance reciprocity. This explicitly brings data, the lifeblood of the modern digital economy, into the framework of trade rules, acknowledging that data is the new, most valuable currency of global commerce.
Yes, data flows are intrinsically linked to trade and services, digital products, AI development, and advanced manufacturing. This rule argues that data governance reciprocity must become a core norm of 21st century trade agreements.
What does data reciprocity mean in practice?
It means that nations imposing significant restrictions on cross-border data flows or demanding costly data localization, requiring data to be stored within their borders, must provide functionally equivalent access to their data for their trading partners under comparable privacy and security safeguards.
So no more one-way data straits.
Exactly. The principle is that no nation should be able to build AI supremacy or dominant digital platforms by hoarding its own vast domestic data reserves while simultaneously benefiting from largely unrestricted access to the open data streams generated in other countries. It ensures that the digital infrastructure supporting 21st century trade and innovation is more balanced and mutually accessible, preventing data colonialism. Okay, so that's the 10-rule charter. It's a comprehensive, ambitious blueprint designed for this new age of industrial realism. But the huge question remains, how do we actually implement something like this? Especially when comprehensive reform at the full WTO, requiring consensus from all 164 members, seems completely stalled.
Right, that's the crucial implementation challenge. We can't realistically wait decades for every single WTO member to agree on such fundamental changes. The problems are happening now.
The most practical implementation path, as suggested by several of the sources, is likely not through full WTO consensus initially. Instead, these rules could form the basis of a plurilateral emerging industries protocol.
Plurilateral meaning?
Meaning an agreement adopted initially by a smaller, self-selecting group of willing and significant nations. This would likely need to include the major industrial powers: China, the US, the EU, Japan, maybe India, Korea, but also key representatives from the global South blocs like ASEAN, the African Union, Mercosur, to ensure legitimacy and address their concerns from the start.
So a coalition of the willing approach.
Essentially, yes.
Yeah.
A coalition willing to abide by these stricter rules for governing competition and cooperation in strategic sectors like batteries, AI, green tech, etc., among themselves, without waiting for universal consensus.
And this plurilateral protocol would effectively function as an update or an overlay to the existing outdated WTO rules, specifically the Agreement on Subsidies and Countervailing Measures, ASCM, but tailored for the digital and green era.
Precisely. It would create a more relevant and enforceable set of rules for the industries that matter most in the 21st century, operating potentially alongside the older WTO framework, which might still apply to more traditional goods.
And the desired outcome of implementing such a charter is clear.
The desired outcome is the creation of a new geometry of fairness in global trade. It explicitly acknowledges that fair trade in the 21st century no longer means the somewhat naive 20th century ideal of perfectly free markets operating entirely without state intervention. That's not the world we live in.
Instead, fair trade now means...
It means consciously engineered fair markets. Markets where state power is acknowledged but disciplined by transparency and rules, where innovation is encouraged but its benefits are shared more broadly. where national ambition is permitted but constrained before it leads to destabilizing dominance or dependency, where no single nation can simply weaponize its massive GDP and state capacity to achieve a permanent monopoly on the core technologies that will define the future for everyone else.
The analysts really drive home the historical perspective here, don't they? Comparing the 20th and 21st century challenges.
They do. They argue persuasively that the great trade challenge of the 20th century was primarily about tearing down visible walls, tariffs, and quotas to facilitate freer movement of goods. The far more complex, subtle, and arguably more important challenge of the 21st century is about building transparent, functional, and equitable bridges between different national models, particularly between state-led ambitions and the requirements of global fairness and stability.
So this proposed framework isn't about eliminating competition or state involvement.
Not at all. It's about managing that competition responsibly, channeling state involvement constructively, and ensuring the global system can adapt and survive in an era defined by strategic rivalry and transformative technological change. It's about pragmatic governance for a complex world. #outro.
Well, this deep dive has certainly confirmed the profound, almost tectonic shift underway in the global economy. Industrial policy isn't just an economic tool anymore. It's the fundamental language of 21st century geopolitics. And scale, especially scale backed by coordinated state capacity, has become the decisive strategic weapon.
It really has. We're clearly at a critical inflection point. Relying on the old assumptions about neutral, hands-off markets leading to fair outcomes seems almost guaranteed now to produce global instability, unfairness, and escalating conflict.
The need to move consciously from rivalry driven by opacity and mistrust towards resilience built on transparency and agreed rules seems paramount.
Absolutely. And the core finding from these analyses is that the solution to the massive challenges posed by structural overcapacity and the risk of strategic dependency is not ultimately found in punishment, blame, or ever-escalating protectionism. That way lies fragmentation and decline for everyone.
Instead, the path forward lies in.
It lies in finding mechanisms for coordination, shared restraint, and mutual accountability. Fairness in this new era won't just happen. It has to be actively, carefully engineered through new rules and institutions like the principles in the charter we've detailed today. We need a system that disciplines excessive state ambition while strategically harnessing the immense potential benefits of global scale, innovation, and efficiency.
And this whole complex discussion, it matters deeply to you, our listener. Because the costs of this escalating capacity war, whether they manifest directly as rising prices due to tariffs or less directly through strategic supply chain vulnerabilities that affect product availability, or even through the massive misallocation of global capital towards building redundant factories, these costs impact everyone's access to affordable green technology, reliable supply chains, job security, and ultimately global peace and stability.
Hopefully, you now have a much more comprehensive understanding of the deep structural changes reshaping the 21st century global economy, and at least a tangible blueprint for how the world could respond proactively, moving beyond simple reaction.
As we inevitably shift toward an era where the state's legitimate role in jumpstarting innovation and tackling huge challenges like climate change is more widely accepted, even embraced,
It seems unavoidable.
then we absolutely have to get serious about establishing clear, measurable, and enforceable thresholds for what constitutes acceptable intervention versus unacceptable overreach that harms the global commons. We have to find a way to quantify what dominance actually means in this new context and what responsibilities come with it.
It's the critical next step, defining those lines.
Indeed. We know the state plays a legitimate role, but here is a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you process this deep dive, building directly on that development inclusion clause we discussed. If the ultimate goal is genuine value chain justice and fostering shared technological progress globally, what specific quantifiable percentage threshold of global market share, say, consistently controlling above 70% or maybe 80% of a critical strategic sector should automatically trigger those mandatory obligations for technology sharing, capacity co-investment, and preferential IP licensing for developing nations?
How do we actually quantify dominance in a way that is seen as objective, fair across different sectors and countries, and crucially enforceable in practice? What's the trigger point?
Getting that number or that set of criteria, right, might be the ultimate design challenge for the next generation of global economic governance.
It really could be. Because getting it right could mean the difference between building a genuinely shared global prosperity based on managed interdependence and continuing down the current path towards fragmentation, rivalry, and deepening structural dependency.
A lot to think about. Thank you for joining us for this essential and quite quite lengthy deep dive into the future of global trade.
It was a crucial topic. Until next time.